Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner, and today for Don't Die July we're diving back into a title by Carl John Lee, and I believe this is his debut novel, The Blood Beast Mutations. This was released in May of 2020 and is a novella coming in at 104 pages. Thank you to my good friend Noah in between the lines for recommending this to me. He feels that I will find this a bit more palatable compared to Psychic Teenage Bloodbath, as it's a little bit less bonkers, basically, I think. So, as always, we will take a look at the characters, the story, the world building. I'll talk a little bit about the presentation as well, and then my final thoughts at the end, so let's just throw ourselves straight into this one. This is set during the recent COVID pandemic that we've only just come out of, or at least allegedly come out of at any rate. And this very much captures a lot of the sense of what we all went through at the time, with things like the lockdowns, the inefficiency of government, the lockdown deniers and the people who push back against the evidence and the science, as well as the lack of competence, shall we say, of governments and certain leaders in particular. You have all that here, you have the demonstrations, you have the fact that you've got underfunded and overstretched medical services as we had at the time. And this tells the story of Dan Lewis and his wife, who for some reason I haven't written their name down, which is a bit weird. Basically, they're going through the pandemic as everyone else is, social distancing, doing all the good stuff. But Dan's wife gets ill and is rushed away in an ambulance, and after several days he's not heard anything, but he started to see these videos, and it's assumed, like much was at the time, that this is fake, all fake news, and it appears that these monsters seem to be birthing, for want of a better word, out of people who have the virus. Not everybody, but these bloody monstrosities keep bursting out of people and consuming everything in their path. After not hearing anything from the hospital or his wife, he gets a phone call after a few days saying, "Help me, I need to get out of here," and sort of explaining that what they'd been seeing online was actually true. And he makes the decision to go and get his wife from the hospital and escape. And this then tells the story of him making his way across New York, which is ravaged at the time by very much almost like a militia mentality of people pushing back against the restrictions, and definitely buying what you'd call the MAGA movement as it was at the time. He gets to the hospital only to find it overrun by these monsters, as well as finding the military there as well. And then it becomes a story of him getting in, getting his wife, and trying to get out in one piece. This is an interesting play, actually, on how serious the epidemic could have actually been above what it actually was. Obviously, the chances of little monster people bursting out of people is slight, but it could have always become far more dangerous than it was. And this kind of shows and highlights the issues that there were at the time with people pushing back against a lot of the evidence. And it's actually a really, really genuine look at how a lot of people felt at the time. It's actually a solid story to start off with. Moving on to characters, and obviously the main character is Dan and his wife. This is a novella. There's not a great deal of characterization here, but what is here is decent. These are two people that are obviously deeply in love with each other, have a great connection, a great deal of physical attraction. There's a little bit of humour between them as well in their interactions. Past that, you don't get many other characters in this. You run into a couple of people who are protesting against the lockdown and the economic sanctions, who are very much a caricature of a lot of the views you'd see at the time. And there's another character that you meet and dies very quickly, who is again trying to escape and deal with the fact that these little blood monsters are coming out of people and killing people. Not a great deal here, but in 108 pages you can't expect a deep character piece, and for what they have to do, they do it well. The world building is perhaps the most interesting point in many regards here, because this really does evoke the feeling that a lot of people had during lockdown, the sense of loneliness, the isolation, how annoyed people were at the establishment for their failings or their greed or their lack of action at times, as well as the fact that you did have people pushing back against what the governments were doing to try and help. Things like the go back to work, save the economy movement. And this is very clearly pulled directly from a lot of the feeling that was around the world at the time, and a lot of the things that we saw with people like the COVID deniers or the anti-vaxxers, and the sort of radicalisation in many regards that a lot of the world went through and is still not really coming out of in many regards. You have the presidential addresses, which are really, really well done, whilst it is at no point said that this is President Trump. The way that the character does the press conferences, you can actually hear Trump speaking these lines, and some of them are or feel like direct quotes from some of the stuff he said at the time as well. There's some shots of other world leaders, like the wonderful Prime Minister of the UK at the time, Boris Johnson, that's also in here. And it really does help sort of remind you a little bit of how horrific that period of time was, and it's actually quite good at sort of evoking that claustrophobic feel that a lot of people had at the time. I'm going to talk a little bit about presentation for this one. This is not anywhere near as gory as Psychic Teenage Bloodbath was, which I appreciate because, again, not a massive fan of splatterpunk, as I said in that one. That being said, I don't feel that the writing is as sharp here, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one being that I believe, again, as mentioned, this may well be his debut novel. This came out first, so since then he has honed his craft far more. The other thing as well is this feels like it's a lot more emotional. This was written and released during the pandemic. All these things are very, very raw, and you can see that in the writing, and that is a good and a bad thing, as it takes a little bit of finesse away, but you do get the raw emotional sort of baggage that that whole situation created at the time coming across really, really well. The writing is solid. It's not especially descriptive until it hits some of the more gruesome scenes. There's not that many of them, but I will say that Carl John Lee does an exceptional job of writing grotesque monstrosities once again, and you get a real visceral feel for what you would be seeing during the situations within the story, and that's actually pretty well done. The pacing is also good. It is breakneck, but it's breakneck from a very specific point. It doesn't feel like it's flying off the rails at any point in the story. It doesn't feel like it's going completely batshit mental like Teenage Bloodbath did, which I also appreciate. So, final thoughts. I prefer this to Psychic Teenage Bloodbath, but I don't think it is actually as strong a novel in its genre as that title is. Part of the reason for that is I don't think this is going to age especially well, because whilst it does grab that visceral feel right now of the pandemic, in 15 years' time, people that read this will not be able to quite have that emotional response, or they'll be that divorced from that emotional response over the period of time that it won't have the same effect. Again, there's a bit less finesse in the writing here as well. This is, however, quite well paced. The characters all do the jobs they're supposed to do, and again, the gore and the monsters and the violence in here is firstly not gratuitous, and it is really, really well written. And as a political commentary on the things that happened at the time, I actually think this is really good. Again though, much like the previous title that I reviewed, I still think that this is not going to be a title for everyone. It does still fall in the splatterpunk genre, and the descriptions are very vivid, although again, not as out there and disturbing as they were in Teenage Bloodbath. So for me, this goes in C tier. I do prefer this to Psychic Teenage Bloodbath, and you can actually clearly see, having read both of them now, a progression in the writing between the two as well. If you're a fan of splatterpunk, or you want to relive the glory days, for want of a sarcastic better word, of the pandemic, this might be one for you to read. But that is my thoughts on this. I'd love to know yours. Let me know in the comments. I'll catch you next time.